Well, welcome back, folks. As always, it's so good to talk with you a little bit about Scripture and to have you on board with this whole small group initiative. We do hope it's been fruitful and that you've come to enjoy these times. This week, we jump into chapters 14 and 15, and we come to what is really the climax of Mark's gospel. And we shouldn't at all be surprised by what this entails, even though so much of it is shocking. Because if you remember back to chapter 3, we saw this episode where Jesus heals a man with a withered hand, and it's on the Sabbath. And the religious authorities immediately interject, and they challenge him as breaking the laws of the Sabbath, and thereby see him as a threat to their own religious authority. And so they begin to conspire at the very beginning to kill Jesus. And all along, we've seen it all along, Mark has informed us and Jesus has informed us that the whole plan is that Jesus will be persecuted and will eventually die. And not just at the hands of the Romans, who we might expect, but by Israel, the very people that Jesus came to save. And it's worth pointing out that the religious leaders of Israel, they want him dead in the first place because they see the way Jesus has real power. And it completely threatens their whole existence. And so they want him dead. And we come into this very last stage of this buildup where Jesus is tried and condemned and killed, and it's part and parcel of their being threatened by Jesus. And there are so many things that we could go into in these two chapters. Again, they are the true climax of the Gospel of Mark. But I'd just like to point out a couple that are really important, I think. And first is the way all of this is distinctly part of Jesus' plan from the very start. Notice in chapter 14, right before Jesus is arrested, he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he prays to the Lord, if it's possible to remove this cup, please let it pass. And then, but no, not what I will, but what you will. And all of what happens here is part of God's and Jesus' own will working together. And I think that's a fact that's easy to overlook. It's all part of a divine plan that Jesus willingly enters into. And so this is a climax that it's not just a series of events where there are external actors who are pressing their will onto Jesus, but it is this eternally coordinated act of obedience where Jesus' will coincides with the will of the Father in this beautiful movement of obedience. Now, second, it's important to closely examine precisely what happens on the cross and the whole build-up to it. Jesus is condemned by his own people and he's abandoned by his disciples. Eventually, he's publicly shamed in this brutal and grotesque way on the cross. And then in chapter 15, verse 34, there is this profound moment where Jesus cries out using the words of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And this signals a whole host of things, and we could talk about this for hours as well. But on a basic level, we see Jesus uses this language of God-forsakenness, and we see how it signals that the moment of the cross is way more than Jesus being understood. It signals that all that's happened is way more about this issue of human rejection. And we see how Jesus' act of atonement on the cross is really this moment where something deep is taking place, something between God and himself, some kind of sacrifice or an atoning act. And it is this profound mystery, but it's clearly part of our own redemption. So in that moment, Jesus is, in this very real way, experiencing the necessary outcome of sin, which is God-forsakenness. And in this meeting, I'd really only like you to reflect on a few things. And the first is, what might it mean that Jesus willingly enters into this movement and does so from the very beginning of the gospel story? What does it say about him? What does it say about us? Second, what does it tell us that Jesus not only has to die, but that there is some element of God-forsakenness at work here? What do you think is actually going on in the cross? What is happening? And then third and finally, what do we learn from the way something so tragic could be at the very heart of God's own plan. That is, how does this act of divine abandonment or judgment, this frankly an atrocity, coincide with God's plan? What does that say about our own lives and our own tragedies? I realize there are a whole lifetime of mysteries and truths to ponder in these 2 chapters, but I hope that at the very least you'll begin to do some of that today.